Good evening and welcome to Mets 360 here on Riverside. My name is Brian Jura, and today I'm being joined on the podcast with one of the writers for the site, one of the new writers, and his name is Ryan Johnson. Ryan, thanks so much for being on the podcast. How are you today?
Doing really well. Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm really excited to be chatting with you about the Mets today.
All right, well, let's get right into it. The Mets just completed a 3-game series with the Pirates, and the offense had been pretty good up until this series, but in the 3 games, they scored 4, and then 2, and then 0 runs. So what I want to know from you is how concerned are you about the team's offense heading into the series against the Yankees? And I should say that the Yankees, who lead the league with a 5.81 runs per game average, which is quite daunting.
Well, I'll say I'm not concerned about it from the perspective of the Yankees' offensive numbers. We just came off a 3-game series with the Cubs before we were playing the Pirates, and the Cubs average 5.5 runs a game, just about what the Yankees are averaging. And the Cubs only combined to score 10 runs against us in 3 games. So our pitching has been stout, and our defense has been good enough. And our offense performs, and we perform up to the level of the competition we're playing against. So we took 2 of 3 against the Cubs and we scored 18 runs. And so, and even in the game we lost, we only lost by 1 run. I think generally teams tend to play to the level of their competition. It's why upsets happen in things like the NCAA tournament every year. It's not that a 12 seed is better than a 4 seed. It's just that sometimes you play down to the competition. So that's why in MLB playoffs, in a best of 7 series, the best team's going to win because they're statistically better. So even the best teams can drop games to the worst teams like the Pirates. I want to just point out, because I like hating on teams that the Mets don't like, that the Braves just played the Pirates before the Mets did, and the Braves dropped 2 of 3, only scored 8 runs. So maybe we're underestimating how good the Pirates defense is. I'd like to think I'm joking about that. But as for Mets run production, generally it's been a roller coaster all year with this team. And we've left what feels like an entire country on base. We've struggled with runners in scoring position, but different players have stepped up at different times. It's been really nice to see Brett Beatty hit well for the last couple of games. So the hope is that someone finds a hot swing, can keep the team competitive through this 3-game set with the Yankees.
I think I'm mostly in agreement with you. When the Mets just played the Pirates, we faced their top 2 pitchers in Paul Skeens and Mitch Keller. And Skeens we didn't do much against, and then scored a few runs late against the bullpen. And we didn't do much at all against Keller. And then the shutout yesterday, I think I attribute that as much to the rain as anything that the Pirates pitchers did against us. It was only the second shutout of the season, so I'm not particularly worried about that. Also, playing in the friendly confines, if you will, of Yankee Stadium should also help the Mets scoring.
Yeah, I love that. I think anytime the Mets get a chance to take it to the Yankees in Yankee Stadium, that's a win for Mets fans. And I hope the Mets turn out strong in Yankee Stadium, not only because it's Soto's first game back playing against the Yankees, but he's definitely going to get booed by Yankee fans. So I hope the Mets fans can help drown that out.
Yeah, this may be exactly what we're looking for as something to really jumpstart Soto into the player that he was last year, certainly, and pretty much his entire career. He's performing solidly, but just not up to the expectations that all of us had for him coming into the year. But let's move on. Most teams, I think, have a certain kind of balance, if you will, where they have their starters who are at a certain level, and then they have the reserves, which are at a considerably worse level than their starters. So you know pretty much who's playing day to day if everyone's healthy. But the Mets have a situation now where they have at least 11, and maybe you can even argue 12 or 13 of their players who could legitimately start on a day-to-day basis. And it's really a challenging thing for Carlos Mendoza to balance playing time for both his younger and his older players. What do you think of the job Mendoza is doing balancing the lineup?
I think Mendy's doing a commendable job. He continues to put his players in a position to succeed. For example, sitting Beatty yesterday with a lefty on the mound, but then finding space for him to pinch hit during the game keeps him engaged. So, you mentioned the different players that are getting kind of rotated through the roster. At this point, I think Marte should not be a consideration in Mendy's calculations on any regular basis. And I know that's a joy for you to hear since you don't like Marte generally. I think Mendy playing him about once every 4 or 5 games is the right amount. He's just not hitting well enough to be considered competitive. Not having really any flexibility to play in the field makes his roster spot questionable altogether. So other than him being a good vibes guy, a good teammate, nice to have around the clubhouse, I'll be surprised if he finishes the year on this team. We know that Stearns isn't shy in cutting bait, even on big contracts. I think we all rejoiced when he cut Omar Narvaez a few years ago on that $8 million contract. We just ate it and said, this guy's no good. So there's just too many guys, like you're saying, on this team who can contribute meaningfully to justify Marte's spot on the team. I think another player that ought to be considered in the group of McNeil, Acuna, Beatty, Vientos is Tyrone Taylor. You know, he's been up and down in his plate production, but defensively, he's been really solid. You could make the argument that slipping in the outfield in the series against the Pittsburgh after a questionable line on a deep fly ball, but that's forgivable in my mind when he's making diving plays and just being really overall solid out there in center field. Again, from a Fields perspective, he's come through in some clutch spots, gotten on base, started rallies. So I think Tyrone Taylor definitely deserves the playing time that he's been getting. Mendy rotating through McNeil in center field has also been, I've been happy with. And seeing the young guys, Beatty, Acuna, and Vientos playing second, third, and DH has kept everyone engaged. So I also think that Mendy has shown by sitting Vientos for 2 games, is telling Vientos that nobody's a guaranteed everyday starter, and he's going to leverage the hot hand with matchup considerations as well. So ideally for me, we'll settle into something more of seeing Vientos at DH, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later in the podcast, with Beatty at third and Acuna and McNeil at second. McNeil spelling center field and DH as well throughout the season. I think that would be the ideal lineup for me, but it's really a good problem to have when you have too many good guys on your team and you're having to find spots for them all to play.
For the most part, I've been happy with the way that Mendoza has juggled the lineup. I do think that Taylor should be in there virtually every day. I do think that Vientos should be in there virtually every day. And I think that McNeil should be in there virtually every day. And then because of both the DH spot and the ability of several of these players to perform at multiple positions, gives him some leverage, some creativity to mix and match, as it were. So overall, I'm happy. I'd like to see a little bit more playing time for some people and a little less for, one individual that you mentioned, perhaps another one in there as well. But I don't think it's anything that we should be upset with the manager about at this point. So let's switch over from talking about hitters to talking about pitchers. The Mets pitching has been very good so far this season, which is a surprise given that they started the year with 3 guys who they expected to be on the pitching staff one way or another on the IL instead. So what happens once Paul Blackburn and Sean Manaea and Frankie Montas are ready to return? What do the Mets do with the pitchers who are currently on the staff?
Again, I think it's another situation of having a good problem. You have too many good players to try to fit into too few spots, and that just means that competition is going to happen between all of these players, and they're going to be pushing each other. And I think that brings out the best in a lot of these guys. So to answer your question, I think there's a few options. A lot depends, in my mind, on Tylor Megill's next few starts. So he's kind of struggled his last few starts, and we're starting to see kind of the old Megill resurface a little bit. I think if he can get back to his elite performances that we saw at the start of the year, it'll be hard to justify moving him. But he has an option to return to AAA. So if he continues to struggle, he might be the odd man out, sent down to AAA for a spell. Another option would be Peterson. He's shown that he's an asset out of the bullpen during the playoff run last year. So it's a possibility that Peterson could get moved to the bullpen. I don't think it's likely since the Mets have a number of long relief options in Max Kranick and Huascar Brazoban and Jose Butto, but the lack of a solid lefty in the bullpen might make Peterson an asset in there for the remainder of the year. I think that's unlikely, but it's certainly an option. Ultimately, the Mets have found a way to give their starters an extra day of rest without having to go to a full 6-man rotation. We've had a couple of spot starts or spot relief options from AAA to stretch out the rotation, ensure that really all the starters are pitching on an extra day of rest. But the plan, at least spoken by Mendoza and Stearns, was that we were going to have a 6-man rotation. Slotting in one of those guys and dropping a relief pitcher may be what happens as well. Ultimately, I think these things tend to work themselves out. The Mets have been fortunate not to have additional injuries to the starting rotation since the start of the year. But like I said to start, I think having too many good pitching options is a good problem to have.
Of course, the injuries are the wild card, and nobody knows what's going to happen on that front. And it's certainly among the possibilities that as soon as somebody's ready to come up, that there will be an injured person for him to replace, and everything works out beautifully. But it also could very easily work out the exact opposite way. And it can't be too much longer before Paul Blackburn needs to be elevated from his injury rehab. So, in all likelihood, he's going to be the first decision to be made. And it's clear that the Mets like him. I mean, A, they traded for him, and B, they tendered him in the offseason. And he's out of options. So he needs to be either on the major league roster within a week or so, or he needs to be designated for assignment where he'll almost certainly be lost. So what do the Mets do when Blackburn's ready? I honestly don't have a clue. You could say that they could put him into the rotation, bump Peterson into the reliever spot, and cut or waive Genesis Cabrera. But Cabrera's done a nice job, and do you want to swap him out for Blackburn? I mean, it's not an easy decision, and it's one that may be facing the Mets here in 10 days or so.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Mets had at least anticipated having Blackburn come out of the bullpen to start the season. Like, he did not earn a rotation spot through spring training, and they had announced that he was going to start the year out of the bullpen before he was injured. So it's possible that when they have to activate Paul Blackburn, someone from the bullpen gets bumped and he becomes, a long reliever type. I think the pitchers that we have in our bullpen have been pitching too well to, merit any of them really going. Max Kranick has struggled in a few games, pitched well in his most recent outing. Jose Butto has struggled, but again, he doesn't have options left. So yeah, it is a really tough decision for the team to make.
You mentioned Max Kranick, and certainly a couple of days ago, it looked like he might be a reasonable person to send down for Blackburn, but he seems to have righted the ship and overall has been quite the positive. And Brazaban, they're using him in every spot imaginable. He's been the multi-inning guy. He's been the opener. He's even closed games. And it seems unlikely to me from the far outside that he's going to be the one to go. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to see what ends up happening with Blackburn. I think Minaya is almost 100% guaranteed he's going to be in the rotation somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And then Montas again becomes the wild card. I know a couple of weeks ago on the podcast in the crazy prediction segment, I put forth the idea that Montas won't start a game for the Mets this season. So I could very easily see him being relegated to the bullpen. But again, those are decisions that are at least 3 weeks away, and the Blackburn one seems to be the one that's on the front burner. So let's switch back and talk about the offense a bit. We were talking about trying to divvy up playing time. And one area where it seems maybe we didn't discuss a whole lot is catcher. And Luis Torrens did a fabulous job while Francisco Alvarez was hurt. Alvarez now is back. He's getting the lion's share of playing time, which feels like it's the right decision. But is it? Should they be playing Torrens more than they are? How happy are you with the way the playing time at catcher has been divvied up here the last couple of weeks?
Again, I think the theme of this podcast so far has been, we have so many good players. How do we play them all? What an amazing problem it is to have such a great backup catcher that we even need to have this conversation about is our backup catcher getting enough playing time? So happy that the Yankees decided to cut bait with Torrens and that David Stern snatched him up, because he has been nothing but awesome. When Alvarez was out, watching Torrens throw guys out, like his throwing runners out is like over 50%. Like, this guy is unbelievable at throwing guys out, and he was batting in clutch spots and coming through and hitting guys in. And yeah, Torrens was awesome. So when Alvarez came back, I was concerned about this. But since Alvarez has returned, I think it's been clear that Alvarez has not only improved his pop time and is throwing guys out, but he's also been solid at the plate. He's not hitting for a lot of power. I think he only has that one home run since he's come back. But the things that don't show up on the stat sheet are his leadership in the clubhouse, his communication with the pitchers, his ability to calm down Edwin Diaz, for instance, to just go out, have a short conversation, and Diaz strikes out the side. Like, all of a sudden, you realize that the value that Alvarez brings goes beyond just the metrics that show up on the stat sheet, but he has improved at blocking balls behind the plate. He's improved at throwing guys out, trying to steal. Like, I think just generally Alvarez has shown that he's clearly the guy. But I do appreciate that Torrens is still getting in, usually once per series. He's showing why he's an elite backup. But ultimately, I think Alvarez getting the majority of the playing time is definitely the right call.
It seems to me that in a standard rotation, you play 6 games in a week. You usually have a Monday or a Thursday off. And in those 6 games, the usual breakdown is that the starting catcher will play 5 times and the reserve will play 1 time, usually a day game after a night game. It might be different if you have a lefty hitter and, maybe you run a quasi platoon. But anyway, I like Torrens. I'm very comfortable with him as our backup for all of the reasons that you stated. I'm not sure how much he should play above that 1 game per week. I mean, maybe it's 1 game 1 week and 2 games the next week, something like that. I think maybe some minimal time more than a traditional setup between the 2 catchers, but not a lot, because ultimately I think that Alvarez has a much higher ceiling. So that's the way that I think that it should play out. And, pretty much happy again with the way that Mendoza is handling things there.
And I feel like every time Torrens gets into a game, he's getting hit in some area of his body. So the last time he was out there was not so pleasant for him, unfortunately.
I swear I've watched that replay like 50 times, and I know where it hit him. And I look at that area, and I just can't see it. I don't know if my eyes are going completely blind, but it almost seems like it just barely grazed the area. But for the amount of time that he was down, that it was more than just a graze.
Sometimes, though, just the graze is hurts a little more.
All right. Well, let's talk about somebody who's not getting grazed, but who's actually pounding the ball, and that's Pete Alonso. So much has been made about Alonso and his improved plate discipline, and certainly for the first 30 or so games, that's exactly what we saw. We saw him laying off pitches, only swinging at strikes for the most part, and leading the league in just about every category. But here in the last week or so, the worm has turned a little bit, and we're seeing a return to what we saw, which was not so great in the past couple of years. And specifically, Alonso has 2 walks and 15 strikeouts in his last 8 games. So how concerning is that to you?
Nobody thought that Pete was going to maintain the torrid pace that he was on. It was completely amazing to witness. He was incredibly clutch. But all players go through streaks in baseball, even the best players. And so I think what matters most is that throughout the course of 162 games and, multiple hundreds of at-bats for Alonso, he, finds his swing. He maintains the plate discipline that he was showing, throughout the first 30 games of the season. And I think he'll end up being, a significant factor in the Mets offense throughout the whole season as a whole. And you have written multiple articles on Mets 360 about, looking at guy's track record through a certain number of plate appearances. In fact, just the one you posted today on Thursday, you look at different stretches of someone's number of plate appearances, and it just shows that guys are streaky. And I think Alonso maintaining the pace that he was on was not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And even the best players go through streaks. So I think he's going through a lull that he'll break out of in no time. Playing against the Yankees this upcoming series might be the perfect place for him to break out. Hopefully he gets an opportunity to take Devin Williams to the opposite field for a home run of this series. So we'll see how that plays out. But I'm not concerned about Pete Alonso really at all.
I want to ask you about something that I've heard other people mention, and that's in this stretch where Alonso has struck out a whole lot more than he's walked. He was perhaps hurt by some umpire calls on close pitches that went against him.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of value do you place in that? Do you think that some tough calls from the umpire can put you in a tailspin?
For sure. I mean, if you listen to Gary Cohen or really anybody who's watching Pete at the plate on a day-to-day basis, you'll say Pete has an elite eye. Like, he is seeing the ball so well. In 2024, he was swinging at pitches outside the plate, off the plate and down and away. That was his kryptonite, and everybody kind of knew that. And he is laying off those pitches at a high rate this year, which is really amazing. But when the umpire starts calling these borderline pitches as strikes on the pitches that you've been practicing laying off of, all of a sudden you're like, well, I have to cover the outside low part of the plate again. And you get back into nasty habits. So sure, I think that the way that the game is called by the umpire certainly can make an impact on how he swings and his results as a result of that.
All right. Well, let's talk about defense here for a few minutes. And one thing that is at least a little concerning to me are the miscues, the muffs by Francisco Lindor, who's essentially a Gold Glove caliber shortstop. What do you make of Lindor's defensive issues so far here early in the season? One of his values is that he plays great defense at a premium position. And he just isn't doing that here the first 40 or so games of the year. Do you think that's something the Mets need to be aware of going forward? Do you think it's just a fluke? Where do you stand on Lindor's defense?
I think, again, it kind of depends on which section of games you're willing to look at. Because if you look at, he had a 2-error game at the beginning of the season, that's so unlike him, or he's had a couple of throwing miscues in the last couple of games, that's so unlike him. You can look at that as part of the whole and say, wow, he's had a not good defensive season. But then you look at other highlights and stretches of games where Lindor has been absolutely solid and making plays that most people wouldn't be able to make. And I think you can say, he still is an elite Gold Glove caliber fielder. So I don't want to make excuses for him, but I'm about to. I don't look at his few gaffes on defense as an overall downward trend to be concerned about. I think he's a Gold Glove defender 90% of the time. I think 10% of the time he's a human being. Even, and I think something that's not talked about with elite players is that he has a life outside of baseball, including having 2 young kids at home. I also have 2 young kids at home, and there are days when I show up to work completely gassed. And I think Lindor's a family guy. He walks up to my girl, in most at-bats, I'll say. It used to be every at-bat, but now he walks up to ain't no mountain high enough sometimes, which we don't have to talk about. But I think it shows that he's a family guy. And so he's the kind of guy who wants to go home and be with his kids. And sometimes having an infant impacts your sleep, impacts how you prepare. And so I think it shows that he's a human, that, the 10% of the time that he's kind of making some mistakes that we haven't seen him make before could be credited to the fact that, hey, he's got 2 young kids at home. There's other things going on for him outside of baseball that might be impacting him. And I think the fact that he continues to maintain a very high level of play most of the time shows that it's not a downward trend.
As long as we're talking about defense, I don't think there's any way around talking about what happened to Mark Vientos on Tuesday night. And for those of you who may have missed it, Vientos was in the field at third base like he usually is. Ball was hit to him. He went to his backhand, a very normal play. However, what happened next was not normal. Vientos has what they call a T-web glove, and you may have used one of these when you were younger, but it's a glove designed to make it easier for you to get the ball out of the glove, transfer it from your glove hand to your bare hand to throw. Instead of having a complete leather pocket, it has a T-shaped with spaces in the four quadrants that the T makes. And in the game Tuesday, Vientos had his glove to field the ball, and the ball went through one of the open pockets in his glove. And remarkably, at least to me, it was scored a hit. And even more strange was the fact that he kept the same glove for the remainder of Tuesday and then used the same glove last night. And I just want to know what you think about the whole T-Web glove fiasco that we witnessed on Tuesday night. Do you think that Vientos should have done something different, or was this just a one in a million fluke that we shouldn't put too much weight on?
I'd like to go on record and just say I think Mark Vientos should hang up his glove altogether and just be the Mets DH. I don't think he provides enough stability at third base defensively with gaffes like the ball going through his glove or hitting off of his chest, which it did, or going between his legs, which again, the between the legs play and the through the glove play both got ruled not errors, which I don't, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like he literally touched the ball. How is that not an error? But okay, my question is why do we keep running him out there at third base? I think he can impact the team better with his bat. Beatty is a more solid defensive option at third base. And I think the only thing holding up from Vientos being the DH is that Marte is still on this team. So you're probably singing joyous praise over there. But if we can cut ties with Marte and just move Vientos to DH, we don't even have to talk about his glove anymore because a lot of these questions can just be answered. He's called Swaggy V for a reason. I think he thinks he's, really great at everything he does, and he certainly shows flashes, but I really just don't think he should have a glove at all on this team.
Do you have any qualms about moving a player who I believe Vientos is 5? Let's just say that he is 25. Do you have any qualms about moving a 25-year-old permanently to D?
That's a great question. I think there are players that profile that way. I think Ronnie Mauricio is another great example of a player that probably profiles as a DH more so than a fielder. And that's okay. You'd like to think that young guys are going to be fast in the field and sure handed, and sure, they might make mistakes and so on and so forth. But, I think the flexibility that having a guy like Vientos earmarked as your primary DH make is that he doesn't have to be DH forever. He can go in at third base every now and again. He can go in at first base every now and again. Unlike Marte, who basically has only played one game in the field so far through 40 something games. Like, if you said, Vientos is going to be my everyday DH and my occasional third base and occasional first base, then you're not pigeonholing him into just a hitter forever. But yeah, great question. It's tough to say you're 25 and going to be a DH forever.
All right, well, we've reached the crazy projection part of the show. I'm going to give you what I think is a crazy prediction, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on it. And then I'm going to ask you to give me your crazy prediction, and I'll comment on it. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. My crazy prediction is that Pete Alonso, currently with a 311 average, finishes the year with a sub 270 mark. So tell me, how crazy is that?
Crazy, Brian.
I like
it. I think it's realistic to think that Pete Alonso is going to cool off, and he is showing signs of cooling off. I don't think anybody thinks he'll finish with an average above 300, but, and this is not an original thought to me. I just consume Mets content at a torrid pace. I think he'll finish above 280. I think he'll have a really great season. He seems so comfortable behind the plate. He's hitting, for average, but he's hitting for power. I mean, he really is doing it all. He's seeing the plate so well. So he would really have to have quite the fall off for you to think that he's going to hit below 270. So I'm curious to hear from you. Why do you think Pete Alonso is going to be hitting below 270 average?
Pete Alonso came up in 2019, and he's played every day since then. And he's never had an average higher than 271. So my prediction for him not to have his best ever batting average in a single season on one area, that's not crazy. I mean, that's normal to predict him not to have a career best mark. But given the start that he's off to, which would require a drop of over 40 points, I do think that's substantial. I certainly don't think it would be unreasonable to expect him to hit like 275 or 280, and I'm just undercutting that a little bit. Hopefully that's enough for it to merit craziness. And those were the first words out of your mouth, so I'm not letting you take it back. So
It is crazy. I think to doubt Pete Alonso, especially with what he's shown this year, that's crazy. So good job. You've completed the crazy challenge.
all right, so hit me with yours.
Okay, so do you want me to give you the one-liner of my crazy or give you the reason with the one-liner?
Start out with the one-liner, and then I'll comment on it.
My crazy prediction is that the Mets will let Soto opt out in 2029.
Well, I don't think that's crazy. I'm not sure that it will work out that way either. I know during the off season before he signed with anyone, one of the things that I was throwing out there was, look, ideally we would sign him to a 5-year contract. So why don't we just incredibly overpay him for 5 years? And then that way you're not left stuff holding the bag for the last 8 or 10 or whatever years it is. And people scoffed at that, said there's no way that he would sign such a deal. And they were right. But essentially what we have is what could very easily be a 5-year contract. And it's certainly not unrealistic to think that the next 5 years, the heart of his prime, that Soto will perform great and then be in a position where he can opt out. But generally speaking, clubs re-sign guys who opt out if they're able to. And certainly with Cohen's wealth, they'll be able to. So to me, the unknown is how far they're willing to push the envelope. And 5 years from now, certainly that puts both the Lindor and Nimmo contracts in the very tail end of their stage, which may make it easier to do the long-term deal with Soto. Lots of unknowns here. I think, I guess ultimately I would say I see your scenario, A, ideally, B, unlikely. So it doesn't quite raise to the level of crazy in my point of view, if that makes sense. But I think it would likely be in the Mets' best interest if he opts out and they let him go.
That's kind of the way that I'm looking at it as well. The Mets can override his opt out in 2029 by upping
Right.
his annual salary from 51 to 55 million, and they'll be on the hook for the remaining 10 years of his contract. So I think one of three things will happen. Either he'll choose not to opt out, and that'll mean he hasn't been playing that well. So the Mets will have to pick up the remainder of the contract. Or he does opt out and the Mets let him walk, which was my crazy prediction. Or we'll have a Garrett Cole repeat where he says he's going to opt out and the Mets call his bluff and he opts back in and he gets $51 million for a total of 765 over 15. Either way, I think the Mets would be right to let him walk in 2029. Like you said, we would have essentially signed a 5-year deal in his prime. And to me, that seems like a good deal, especially since he's a lock to be the full-time DH by the time he hits 30 anyways. I was, just incidentally, I was listening to the game yesterday and Keith Rad mentioned as Azokar was sprinting through right field and making catches on line drives look easy, Rad was pointing out that Soto doesn't really have a lot to offer in right field defensively. And so with Soto's lack of impact in clutch spots from the plate this year and being essentially a net negative in right field, I think it's going to be the right call for the Mets to let him walk in 29.
It's it's a fascinating discussion, and the only thing bad you can say about it is that it's too soon to really have it seriously. But that doesn't mean that we can't discuss it and what's important and what isn't. I know a lot of people accuse me of still having a mindset of trying to extract value for every dollar of a contract, and I guess that's a fair criticism. But at some point, Steve Cohen didn't become a billionaire by making bad business decisions. And you have to wonder if paying somebody $55 million a year for 10 years for their age, what is it, 32 to 40 seasons, or whatever the actual number is that a good business decision? It may be. It may be. It may be that he becomes such a fan favorite over the next 4 or 5 years that it's kind of a uh, you know, cut off your own nose to spite your face type of thing. Somewhat akin to what people felt like the Mets were doing with Alonso this past
Mm-hmm.
offseason. So, maybe it makes economic sense in the long run without necessarily making dollar to war sense in the short run. I don't know the answer to that. But I guess I want to rephrase my original answer, because I do think there's crazy elements to what you said. I wouldn't go 100% crazy, so let me say 80% crazy.
Hey, you know what? 80% is passing, so I'll take that as a win.
All right. All right. Well, let's go and talk a second about one of my favorite players, and that's Brandon Nimmo. Nimmo was horrible in the second half of last year, and he essentially continued that for the first 25 games or so of this season. But here lately, he's turned it on after a very poor start. So I want to know, how do you see him performing the rest of the way?
Yeah, Nimmo certainly is the king of keeping us on our toes. I was listening to Steve Gelbs on a rival podcast talk about how Nimmo changed his approach at the plate. Essentially, he was an on base machine to being much more aggressive. So, swinging at first pitches, looking to be hitting for power. And this change was based on data being shown to him by the Mets hitting coach Jeremy Barnes. They were projecting him to be an impact player through this new approach. But like you're saying, throughout much of the start of this season, he's been horrible. I mean, hitting cleanup means he's hitting in spots with guys on base. And to date, Nimmo has left 95 guys on base, and that leads all of Major League Baseball in guys in runners left on base. I guess the stat is not technically guys left on base, runners left on base. So Gelbs was pointing out that the numbers would indicate he's just been unlucky. So Nimmo's recorded 127 hard hit balls during the 25 season. It's a hard hit rate of 55.1%. So over half of his balls have an exit velocity of 95 miles an hour or higher. So it's an improvement from 2024, where he was only posting a hard hit rate of 47%. And his average exit velocity is 92.6 miles an hour, and his barrel rate has risen to 11.8%, up from 9.1% in 24. So I'm saying all these stats because it essentially indicates that over the course of 162 games, he's going to find gaps with the ball. The ball is going to fall into play. We're starting to see that happen now. A little bit more production out of him in the cleanup spot than we ever have before. So I think the transformation from who he used to be, this speedy on base guy, but who never steals bases, to an older kind of power slugger, it's the right call for him. I'm definitely on Team Nimmo. I hope he stays healthy enough to show that the stats, that his improved power, that they're not an anomaly, that the ball is going to start falling for him. I don't expect him to have 9 RBIs every game, but if he could get, just some of those balls to fall in, certainly the players in front of him are getting on base often enough that he should be on a good pace to hit over 100 RBI, over 30 home runs. I really think he can get there.
I haven't checked in about a week, but the last time that I did check, that hard hit rate that you quoted that put Nimmo in the 92nd percentile among all major league hitters. So he's certainly doing quite well with his contact. He just hasn't been having great luck with the results. Like you mentioned, you would have to expect that over a full season that the results will eventually equal the contact that he's providing. The only thing that we have to, I guess, worry about as a counterbalance is that end to last year, where he was hitting the ball well in that stretch too and was having absolutely nothing to show for it. Some have speculated that we can at least partially explain last year's numbers due to the various lower body injuries, specifically his plantar fasciitis. I'm not sure. You're never sure. We can attribute 30% of the results to the injury. I mean, we're never sure what percent to ascribe to that. The only thing I can say is it's not 100%. I mean, some of that was just he wasn't doing well. And it's tough to just throw out the window 250 300 plate appearances, whatever it was, at the end of 2024 when he didn't perform. So that has to be in the front of our mind. But still, my hope and my additional hope is that my expectations aren't being overly influenced by my having Nimmo as one of my favorite players. But I do think that we're going to see better results moving forward.
Certainly the stats back that up. And, Nimmo is a hard worker, and he's played through injury and he's playing through pain. And, you can see even this season that he's had some, injury issues. So as he continues to work towards this new type of hitter that he's becoming, I think we'll see the results. I, too, am a Nimmo fan and really want to see him succeed. I'm glad that he's been playing well out in left field. I think that he's been, a pick-me-up for the team at times. Some of my favorite highlights from the postseason are Nimmo just absolutely blasting homers to the second deck. Like when he gets a hold of one, he's just as strong as any other player on this team. He can really hit it far. So yeah, I'm excited for the transformation of Nimmo. At times it felt like just being an on-base machine was not as impactful of a player that for this team. And a guy who can hit in the cleanup spot and bring guys in, I'd really like to see him, mature in that role.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I want to look forward with this question. So the Mets are off to a very good start, but by no means are they guaranteed of keeping this up and making the playoffs. I think a lot of people anticipate that the Mets are going to make a trade, a big trade, before all is said and done. And if they do indeed make that move between now and the trade deadline, which position do you think they'll trade for, and who do you think might be in play as far as what we give the other team to entice them to give us what we need?
So during our series with St. Louis a few weeks ago, I was convinced that the Mets were going to make a move for Arenado at third base. As I've said multiple times through this podcast, Vientos is too much of a defensive liability at third base. And if the Mets are trying to be a true World Series contender, like I mentioned earlier, a best of 7 series, teams are going to exploit weaknesses, and that would be a big hole with the Mets defensively. So Stearns has always valued, and he's shown this through 2 off seasons with us, that he values defensive upside in guys. And St. Louis was shopping Arenado and his contract this offseason. So it seemed to me like a fit. Now, all of that being said, Brett Beatty decided that he was going to play up to his potential the last 2 weeks. And it seems like if he can play this way, hard hit balls, home runs. I mean, geez, if he can hit 3 home runs every 2 games, can't sit him. So with Beatty playing up to his potential, it seems like he will potentially be the heir apparent that we've all been hoping he could be at third base. So if he continues to excel, I think it's unlikely to then see a trade for someone like Arenado, who is just elite defensively at third base. We just won't have space for him. So the most likely trade in my mind then would be for pitching. Sandy Alcantara is coming off a Tommy John surgery, and he's been struggling in Miami this season. But We know that the Marlins will want to unload him this year if they can get the right price. I think the Mets should definitely look to add him to the rotation. I think him getting with the Mets pitching lab and getting right, getting healthy. He's on a team friendly contract. The Mets would have him for 2 more years beyond this year. So he would be a slam dunk trade target in my mind. I know there have been recent reports of bringing in Luis Robert Jr. to the team, but he hasn't produced in 2 seasons. So I'm not sure why we think he'll just turn it around once he arrives in Queens. If anything, I think players tend to struggle in New York when they arrive. Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto at the beginning of this year to some extent. So yeah, I as far as like Luis Robert goes, I don't want him on the Mets. So for players I'm willing to see go, pretty much everyone in the minors to me is tradable. I would be sad if the Mets shipped off Ryan Clifford, Nolan McLean, or Jet Williams. But I think prospects are considered prospects because they haven't really proven themselves at the big league level yet. So none of the AAA guys scream untradeable to me, even if they turn out to be the next Pete Crow Armstrong, which was always, that's a tough trade to swallow, tough pill to swallow, especially since apparently the Cubs were asking for Matt Allen, who hasn't pitched a game in years, just got called up to, I think, single A. So while I say all that, I think Stearns is a really good negotiator. And I don't think any of our top guys are going to be sent out to bring in a rental. In the hypothetical trade for Alcantara, I'd be willing to send a package like Blade, Tidwell, and Ronnie Mauricio over to Miami for Alcantara and maybe another low-level prospect back from them.
It's going to be real curious to see what Stearns did because he didn't really make a home run type move last year. He certainly made a bunch of trades, but he didn't get anyone at the level of an Alcantara. My opinion is that it'll probably take more than the 2 players that you listed to get him from the Marlins. And the Marlins are holding all the cards in this. They've got a player with a very high ceiling who's done it at the major league level, who's on a reasonable contract and comes with 2+ years of control. So I'm sure that they're going to hold out for at least 3 premium young players in return, and it wouldn't even surprise me if the price was higher than that.
We'll see. I think, to some extent, because Alcantara's not performing this year, that yes, Miami has the cards and they don't have to trade him, but they're going to take the best offer, whatever the best offer is. I think the Mets have a stacked farm system. I think Dave Groveman has done a great job of covering that for Mets 360. Enjoyed listening to him on the podcast a few weeks ago. He'd be obviously a great person to weigh in on this. So Dave, put it in the comments what you think. But I think ultimately there's nobody in the farm system, for me at least, that is untouchable. We all had really high hopes for Brandon Sproat, going to make huge waves, going to break into the starting lineup, and he's really struggled in AAA. One of the reasons I mentioned Nolan McLean, it's like, yeah, he's looking really good. He's flying through the system. But AAA tends to eat up our pitchers for some reason. Like, guys don't pitch well there. So it's really tough to say any of these guys are just like untradeable. And then there's a ton of hype around Jet Williams, but Jet Williams has, he lost all of last season to injury and he's like fine. It's really the hype is from 2 years ago. Same thing with Ronnie Mauricio, like lost a whole year to injury. He showed flashes of being able to hit at the major league level, but for all the talk we had about Ronnie Mauricio coming up and impacting the second base conversation on the Mets this season, the way that he's performing, on his rehab stint right now, there's no reason to think that he's going to have any impact on the 2025 Mets, nor should he. So, yeah, as far as trading for an impact piece, last year Stearns acquired guys like Ryan Stanek, Phil Maton. We went out and got Huascar Brazoban. Like Brazoban and Stanek both impacted this team and have stayed on the team. So while they didn't seem like big splashy players like an Alcantara would be, I think Stearns has the right approach about not selling the farm to get a rental like a Dylan Cease or a Michael King or one of those guys who would only be here for a year. or for a few months at that rate. Yeah, so I just generally think that the team is good enough as it is, and we don't need to sell away solid prospects for somebody. Again, the exception being maybe Alcantara because he's controllable for another 2 years.
He's Ryan, and I'm Brian. And the two of us would like to thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast and hope you'll be back again soon. Good night, everyone.